Still Loading podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Stephen P., Ryan K., Matt aka Stormageddon, Eric H., Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, Gilmer, and Mr. Biscuits have all been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and see everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, 50 years of boss fights. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode, I am joined by an author. It's been a little bit since I've had an author on the show. I'm trying to think, have I interviewed any other authors this year? I think I might have interviewed one other one, but I'm joined today by Daryl Baxter, who has recently written a book, and it recently came out called 50 Years of Boss Fights. And I cannot wait to talk to him about this. But of course, before we get into that, Daryl, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you, Josh. Yeah, I'm good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming on the show and setting aside some time. Always a pleasure chatting with some people, like some new people, meeting new people. So I've been looking forward to this. I got a review copy of your book, and I really enjoyed what I full disclaimer, I didn't get to read all of it, but what I did read, I really enjoyed. Specifically, I'm going to have to bring it up on my phone because I don't think I downloaded it on my PC. The one, I love how eclectic the mixture of bosses that you chose for this are. Like it's not just like, here's some ones that everyone's expecting. There are some ones that that people were expecting. Now I got to bring up my PDF reader. Where are you at? But yeah, I like the selection of bosses, and specifically what I really, really loved, it's actually the first entry in your book all about what I guess most people consider to be the first boss fight, D&D of the D&D video game. And I was so excited that the fact, like, one of the things that was brought up in that little section was the Play-Doh computer system, something that I feel like not a lot of people talk about.
Yeah.
And I loved that. For those who don't know, the Play-Doh computer system was in like the 60s and 70s, and it was mainly in like universities, because obviously home computers were not a thing. It was a crazy advanced computer system for its time. Like there was like even proto MMOs not MMOs, but multiplayer games on them and stuff like that. It's just wild. So I really enjoyed the selection. But anyway, I've been going off about how much I enjoy what I've read of your book. Before I get into the specifics, I have a couple questions, obviously, about the bosses in here and everything like that. But I want to ask you, what was the inspiration for this book? I'm doing a little digging at some of the stuff you do. You have a podcast called Pal Keys. And I saw on there that you ask your guests about memorable games and a boss stage. So it really seems like you've been really like fascinated by the concept of a game boss for quite some time. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, what about video game bosses interest you so much? And in turn, how did that lead you to wanting to write a book about them?
Yeah, sure. So to be honest, this goes all the way back to kind of like when I first played Sonic the Hedgehog, like in about 1992, 93, where you'd be like running across a green hill zone, and then at the end, you would face Robotnik, and everything would change. The music would change, the controls in a sense would require you to kind of like use them differently for Robotnik. You wouldn't have to be running across obstacles or things or different ways. And ever since then, that's really intrigued me. And I think even a few years after, when I was playing fighting games like Tekken, I was always interested into like how the final bosses would be, and
Hmm.
it's always like really interested me. And so you're right. I mean, it's always been an interest of mine. And yeah, I mean, I had been doing Palkey since I think about 2018. And
Okay.
yeah, and that question has always been like part of the podcast, because I feel like it's always like a nice icebreaker for a guest, because it always kind of like shows like their history of gaming as well. And there's been so many like different bosses that have been like throughout the show. It's been really great. But another part of it actually was the fact that my first book, Making a Tomb Raider, I mean, that was just like a book I made during the pandemic in 2020. And
Hmm.
I was talking to people involved with the first two games about the bosses, and they kind of said to me that they kind of made the bosses in a rush. I mean, it was like during the end of development for Tomb Raider 1, Tomb Raider 2, and they kind of just ran out of time. I mean, the first game, for instance, I don't know if you played it, Josh, but when you have like the pyramid and everything's falling apart, and you face the antagonist Natala, it's just a shootout. You climb some ledges, you get on a slope, and that's it. There's like nothing else. And they always
Hmm.
said that they really like regretted like how that turned out. And since then, when I submitted that book, it always got me thinking like, what is like a good boss fight? What is a good boss stage? What's defined it? And it just kind of went from there, really. So since like 2020, that was kind of like when the first throws of the book came about, and I only kind of like start properly writing it about middle of 2022, and here we are. So yeah, that's kind of how it all came to be.
I really love this idea because this is not meant to throw any shade at the other authors I've had on the show, but a lot of the other authors I've had on the show, a lot of their books are kind of like compendiums of like,
Mm,
here's a list of like games around a specific theme.
mm,
Cozy games or like relaxing games or like
yeah,
horror games or movie tie-in games or stuff like, which I find interesting personally. But what I like about this is that instead of a list of games, it's a list of boss fights. And I guess, how did you go about choosing which bosses to include in this book? Like what,
mm.
like was there theming involved? Were you looking to cover, like, all right, I need something old and something new, or was it trying to span across different genres? Like, what type of methodology did you use to choose the bosses that you included in this book?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, it was with great difficulty. I mean, it took a while for this list, because it was chopping and changing like for a good while. Because I knew, like, like I said, first had the idea in 2020, it would take me a while to kind of finalize the list. Because look, there are so many like games released, between like the early 70s
Yeah.
to now. And I'm not being sarcastic. I mean, that is the truth. And picking the right bosses for this book was a challenge. And I was kind of balancing it between like my own history of gaming, but also with what a lot of people remember too. And yeah, it did also involve like Palkeys as well. So yeah, it really changed like throughout I think the next 18 months when I first started to do it. And I really kind of wanted to get into like how people saw a boss, because it isn't really just about the difficulty as well. It is also about like the
Yeah.
fun of it as well, and how it kind of leads up to the boss as well. Because there's a lot of memories and nostalgia in facing a boss, and it could be terrifying, it could be fun, it could be
Hmm.
scary. I mean, like take Nemesis for instance, Resident Evil 3, like the original. I mean, I don't think anyone expected Nemesis to kind of like follow you all around like Raccoon City Police Station, and it's a reason why he features in the book, because it's just something that's so memorable and exciting for an era like 1999. So that was kind of another factor as well. Like, how memorable is it? How iconic is it as well? So yeah, it did chop and change. I mean, in the beginning, I will say, Josh, like it started like 100 bosses, but I thought if I did that, I'd probably still be writing it right now. So I wanted to kind of limit
Yeah.
myself, really, kind of like see how it would be, and it went to 51 bosses because 51, it reminded me of Pokemon. 151, Mew, Hidden Thing, 51. So I thought I'd just go for that. Weirdly, a nice round number. It's not, but it is for this book, so go with it. And I was happy with it. It all kind of works out well. And yeah, so that's kind of really how it all came to be.
What, I guess, for when you had to take such a wide swath of bosses, and like, you said you talked to people on PAL keys, like, I guess, what to you were you looking for when choosing it? Like like I was saying, like did you try to, I guess, like you mentioned before, like boss is it's more than just the fight itself.
Mhm.
It's the lead up to it, and it's the lead up to it, or it could be the walk or the gauntlet leading up to it, or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, what do you, I guess, to be more specific, what do you personally look for in a boss fight? Like, what's something that interests you when you're fighting a boss?
It's a few things. So I think first of all, it has to be fun, has to be memorable, has to be challenging, but also it has to be a test of the skills and the controls that you've kind of learnt up to that point. And that can apply to a fair few bosses. It could be from Dark Souls to Shadow Colossus to, like Crash Bandicoot. I mean, it really can. And a great boss is something that really kind of tests your skills that you've learned in the specific game up to a certain point. Because I think one of the worst bosses, I have to say, is the ones that just kind of don't really do much. They might kind of maybe change the music. They kind of like have you into kind of a certain room, restrict you, but are immensely challenging up to the point where it's too frustrating to fight a boss, to the point where you're throwing the
Mm-hmm.
controller on the floor and you're thinking, well, screw this, I'm just going to like go outside and just kind of like chill out for a bit. And to me, that's not like a good boss at all. I feel like that's a way of just, tempting the player to buy a strategy guide to beat it instead, without actually kind of making
Yeah.
them think. So that's kind of like really like specific things really I look for in a boss, and why it kind of led to those 51 bosses that have ended up in the book as well, because they have to be memorable, they have to be fun to fight, and maybe a bit of like a sadist in it too. You like to be beaten
Yeah.
as well, which I think is something that is just fun in the game too.
It's interesting where a buddy of mine, shout out to Dave Jackson from Tales from the Backlog, he did an episode of his show about like should games have to be fun,
Hmm.
and the last little thing you talked about were like where there's a little bit of like frustration and anger, like a little bit of masochism, I guess, going into it.
Hmm.
Like he mentioned like how in a weird sense it's a fine line to walk, and obviously it's personal. It's a combination of personal preference as well as competency from the game devs.
Hmm.
But like sometimes games don't have to be fun in order to actually be fun in a weird sense.
Yeah.
I always think of the final boss of Metal Gear Solid, right? I guess Liquid Snake or whatever it is. Not Metal Gear Solid 3, which is the one of you use one of the bosses from that in your book.
Hmm.
But I was so mad at that final boss fight. I was so frustrated and I was angry, and it was the most frustrating thing in the world. And I even remember my wife, fiance at the time, being like, are you actually enjoying yourself? I'm like, yes, I'm fine. This is great. And it's interesting because the bosses kind of tend to bring out a lot of those elements where it's like, this isn't fun, but because it's so infuriating, it's actually fun.
Yeah.
I don't know how, and I don't know how you can do that in a game. Like, I don't know if that's intentional from game developers or if it's just like a happy coincidence, a happy accident type of thing. How much for you personally do you find do you agree with that idea? I guess that games don't necessarily have to be fun, but they don't have to be fun in the right way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, feel like it's not to sound all cheesy here, Josh, but it's a kind of bit like life in a sense. I mean, I kind of like touch upon this in the
Mm.
intro as well. Like, we all come across like challenges in life that we don't want to do. It could be doing a certain task at work. It could be facing a bully or a manager or something else, but you have to do it because that's what you're meant to do. And I feel like that same methodology applies to certain games. I mean, you bringing up Liquid Snake in Metal Gear Solid is a great one, because I was playing it like that actually a few days ago, and being beaten so many times on top of Metal Gear, and having him laugh at the end of that game over screen. But that temptation to just press continue and just see how it goes to make sure you beat him before that timer runs out is so addicting, but in a good way, because it makes it so fun, because you want to find out what's next and win the battle. But I think also when it comes to Metal Gear Solid, I mean, like the first game is just so incredible and has a narrative that you just kind of want to see what happens next. It's so great. So yeah, I totally agree. I mean, again, fighting a boss doesn't have to be all fun and games, but like I say, in like real life, you're gonna have to just face them regardless.
one of the things you also mentioned that I agree with is like when you're looking at a boss, like a boss should like teach you or like test you on the mechanics that the game has taught
Mm,
you over the course of gameplay. Um, one example I like to give of a game that doesn't do that well. I don't know if you've ever played this. Over in the UK, it was called Sheepdog and Wolf. It was for the
yeah,
PS1.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay, it was called for us here in North America, Looney Tunes Sheep Raider. That it's a 3D puzzle platformer. You play as Ralph Wolf trying to steal sheep from Sam
Mm,
Sheepdog. The whole Looney Tunes thing. It's honestly a really fun game. I really
mm,
enjoyed my time with it. I played it. I owned it as a kid, but never really played it all that much, and then beat it for the first time last year. I want to
mm,
say, but in that game, there is a boss fight that basically like most of the game it's there is some mild platforming mechanics, but for the most part it's just using the like seeing which acme tools you are given by the game and trying to figure out how to use them with the game's like the light platforming mechanics in order to steal a sheep from Sam
mm.
Sheepdog. Well, there's a boss, I want to say towards like it's like the second to last level or something like that. It's towards the end of the game, and it's in like this little arena, so, and the edges of the arena are all surrounded by fire, and you have to um it's or surrounded by lava or something, and there are like these water wheels that you have to jump on the platform to move the water wheel, and you have to do that while also dodging the boss's attacks and everything. And the water wheel does slowly turn back on itself too, so you have to be quick and dodge all this other stuff. And the problem with that is there is no twitch
Mm,
reflex training at all. The game's not really designed around twitch reflex platforming, so you have an entire game devoted to puzzle platforming with very little to no twitch
mm,
reflexes required. And then all of a sudden they give you a boss that makes you do all these things, and it just the boss is like it's hard because you have the whole platform ahead of you, but every time you finish like there's three total of
yeah.
like those water wheels things, and every time you finish cranking one of those water wheels it eliminates a section of the platform that you can or the arena that you can stand on, so you're making the area constantly smaller while having to dodge this boss. It is one of the most infuriating boss fights I've had to deal with, and it wasn't the good kind of frustration or infuriation because it wasn't like what has this
Yeah.
game done to prepare me for this? Very little, and it was not a good time. So I'm with you. I say all that just to kind of explain for myself, or just kind of share an
Yeah.
anecdote in my own personal gaming history of like of something that did not work. And to ask you then, what's an example of a boss fight that you've experienced that you feel did not
Oh,
work?
that's a good question. So, when I was trying to curate this list, I mean, obviously there are a few games that didn't make the cut. I would start writing, I'd start playing the game, and I just think, you know what, it just doesn't fit the book because it doesn't fit those factors that I mentioned earlier to you, Josh. And I have to say, like, one of them was Earthbound, and it was towards the end. I think
Okay.
it was the final, maybe the final boss or towards the final boss. And it, don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic game. It really is. It's unlike any other game I've played on the Super Nintendo. However, that final boss is is so unforgivable and so relentless that no matter how many times you've trained up your characters and you've done every which way to get there, it just wasn't fun. It just felt like the game was purposely just punishing you for getting this far, no matter what. And to me, it just kind of crossed the line that made me feel like it's not teaching you anything, or it's not, bringing you that fun and that joy that a lot of Earthbound did before. And I felt like that was a really fatal thing, like when it came to the book, because, like you say, I mean, a game can be great, a game can be really fun, but if you have a boss that doesn't really kind of test your skills as to what you've learned up until that point, I feel like it really kind of hinders it. And yeah, so I'm kind of with you there. Definitely, it just feels like something like Earthbound just it didn't work for me. So unfortunately, it just didn't make the cut.
I can understand that entirely. Earthbound, that boss fight, it
Mm,
just felt a little
yeah.
underwhelming to me. I guess that's kind of, well, actually, here's a interesting thought. Do you think it's challenging to make a good boss fight? Like, do you think it's harder than people give it
Yeah,
credit for?
definitely. I mean, like you mentioned Metal Gear Solid earlier. I mean, I have featured a few bosses from the series in the book because they're just so innovative in how Hideo Kojima designed these bosses. I mean, you've got the end from Metal Gear Solid 3, you've got Psycho Mantis from Metal Gear Solid 1, and it can be difficult, but I think when you have like some innovation that's used in that series, like plugging the controller into port 2 with Psycho Mantis, is so great. It makes it so memorable.
Yeah,
And I think I think definitely in the last 10 years actually as well, like bosses have been like kind of a lost art as well. I don't feel like until we've seen things like Dark Souls or Elden Ring that has really kind of brought the concept of a boss back. And I feel like it's almost kind of like worried developers because people don't want to do that. You know, they want to have their game enjoyed by millions, and they don't want to have their be stopped in their tracks by a difficult boss. If you see what I mean. Um, so I think the innovation
yeah.
can be so difficult. But when you got someone like Hideo Kojima like looking at a controller port to beat a boss, it's amazing, really. So yeah, I think it's a give and take, really.
I didn't even think about that. You're right. I've been seeing, like, I actually think one of the biggest detriments to games now is that um they they don't have enough boss fights. Like I know
Mm,
Dark Souls has kind of brought it back, and that's great. I'm not a huge Dark Souls fan, and I'll spare all that reasoning for a different episode. But like at least with that, like the bosses do test you on the mechanics the game has taught you, you know.
yeah.
Um, and I what is it? I always go back to like Uncharted as an example. I love the Uncharted games. They're some of my favorite games out there, but with the exception of the second game, and I count the fourth one almost in like kind of like it's like a half a final boss. There's not really a final boss or really any bosses in that game. They use set pieces and quick time events a
Mm,
lot, but like the final boss for Uncharted 1 is just a series of quick time events. That's pretty much it. The final boss
mm,
for Uncharted 3 is also a series of quick time events. 4 kind of does a little bit halfway where like it's not necessarily just quick time events. There's a little bit of like moving around and dodging attacks and stuff, but there's still like it's still quick time event dependent. But
mm.
Uncharted 2, have you played the Uncharted games?
Yeah, I love the second one, especially the train level.
Yeah. The train level's fantastic. And the second one is, I think it's my second favorite. I think I like the fourth one more now. But anyway, that's I'm digressing. In the second game though, the final boss where you play against, I already forget the villain's name. Um I literally was talking about the other week and I remembered it, and now I'm just brain farting on the villain's name. But you he gets all hopped up on like this tree sap drug
Yeah.
pretty much, and you have to Lazarevich, that's what it is. I think it's Lazarevich. Oh, whatever. um and you are given like a little arena, and you have to kite him around to run past these like sacks of tree sap that are growing out of the side of the tree, and you shoot them to blow them up, and that causes the most amount of damage. You can like steadily whittle away at his health with your gun, but it's a lot faster and a lot more. I don't know if you have enough ammo to even take him out with just weapon ammo.
Mm,
Um, so you have to like run past these tree sap sacks, blow them up, and that does the most damage. But the game has taught you throughout the entirety, like there's a lot of combat in the Uncharted games. It's a lot of frenetic, scrambling action. Like you're trying to, run to hide to different points of cover because your cover will break or enemies will flank you and all this other stuff. So they've been preparing you the entire game for this frenetic type of action that you're experiencing with the final boss, and the final boss actually delivers on that. Whereas in other ones, it like yeah, there's quick time events, but it's not satisfying to have your final boss just be a series of quick time events. Like what
mm.
like it's relying entirely on the narrative to like give you that excitement, that give you that feeling of satisfaction.
Yeah.
And this is no shade against the writers. It's hard to finish a story like and make it satisfactory. It's very hard to do. Very few people I think in general like nail it. So it's always a bummer to me when I love the Uncharted games and I like the endings for the most part, but the bosses always felt underwhelming because they weren't really bosses. They were just quick time events.
Yeah.
With the exception of Lazarevich.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's a really like a challenging thing, I think, around the era of when the Uncharted games were out, because I mean, apart from maybe Shadow Colossus, Demon Souls, there aren't really like a lot of like bosses that I can really remember from that era, unless I'm mistaken. That nothing really kind of jumps out at me. And you're right. I mean, when it comes to like quick times, I mean, that's when like the narrative leads more than the gameplay. And in a lot of cases with Uncharted, it works. I mean, there's a lot of set pieces in Uncharted 2, or was it 1? No, Uncharted 2, where like the building collapses and things like that, and it's so great. I mean, it's amazing. It's so much fun. But yeah, there's things like that where it's not a boss fight at all. And you said about set pieces. I mean, like when it came to Rogue Squadron 2, like in the book, and I featured like, the last level as a boss where you face up against 2 Star Destroyers. I mean, it's not set up as a boss at all, but I feel like it is a boss because you see the Star Destroyers like in previous levels, and it leads up to this point. And even though it's following the movies, when you actually face them, it has like an oh shit moment because it's like when you first see like A New Hope and you see that Star Destroyer like after the credit, the opening crawl, and it's huge. And to me, it was the same effect seeing these 2 Star Destroyers and you're like a tiny little X-wing trying to like destroy him. And that's the set piece. That's the boss for me. That works. There's no like quick time actions or anything there. It's just a set piece, and it works really well. So, yeah, don't get me wrong. I love Uncharted, but if you ask me what memorable boss there is from Uncharted, I'd be hard pressed to give you an answer.
And the only one I can even think of is Lazarevich, and that's only if you've played the second one, which is it's not a good track record. 1 out of 4, and well, more if you count Golden Abyss for the Vita.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I really like about your boss selection in this is that you don't always just go with like the final boss of a game. So, for example, BioShock, that's one of my favorite games of all time. But you don't choose like Andrew Ryan, who's not really a boss. I guess it would be, I'm not going to spoil who the final boss is for those who have not played all the way through BioShock, because it is a little bit of a surprise. But Sander Cohen is not the final boss. He is just kind of he's an earlier one. And I guess like what about Sander Cohen, and then in turn other bosses that may not be the final boss, would make you pick them over, say, the final one?
Sure. So it kind of goes back into the thing where it may be considered which bosses to include in the book, and it's how memorable they are. And to me, Sander Cohen stands as one of the most memorable bosses of that generation because it has so much lead up, and it almost like transforms the game when you get to that certain bit in the game into something else completely. You don't feel like you're in like an underwater city. At least to me, you feel like you're somewhere else. And you're in the command of Cohen, because he's on the radio. He's guiding you in a sense. And you're almost forced to watch his show as well. So it's almost like this boss is like the crescendo of like what you've been doing in this section of the game. And not only that, by the time this section wraps up, you're then given a choice whether to save him, kill him. Apologies, I'm spoiling this for anyone, but
it's all good.
It's also the option of choice here as well, which helps you in certain ways as well, like throughout the rest of the game, which I find so interesting. Because even when you see Cohen like down the steps, I mean, I said it like in a UK way of like, he's almost like a game show host, like coming down the steps in a famous way, like showcasing himself. And I just found it so alluring, like so like amazing, and how different it was. And then, when I spoke to the people involved about Cohen as well for the interviews, I mean, they said like just how much they kind of worked on this section. I just found it so interesting. So yeah, that was like one of the aims. Like it wasn't to feature a final boss in the book. It was to have the most memorable bosses as well in the book, like Cohen, and like the one from Gunstar Heroes, of course, I'm recording this podcast with you, Josh. I had to forget the name, but you know, it's
I
not.
can look it up for you. Don't worry. I can look it up for you.
But it's not a final boss in Gunstar Heroes, but it's a memorable one.
Seven Force.
That's the one, yeah. Seven Force, memorable boss, not a final one, but it's so great. So yeah, I was always trying to make sure that it was a memorable boss as well, not just a final one. Which, of course, Metal Gear Solid also is an example of that too.
Yeah, well, Psycho Mantis is such like that. That's obviously the boss you chose for that one. It is very much like that. That very much plays into what you're talking about with like Sander Cohen. Sander Cohen's an interesting one too because I felt like you ever see the movie House of Wax? Like I've never seen the original. I've only ever seen the
remake,
mid-aughts remake with Paris Hilton.
Yeah, same.
But his artwork, like, because Sander Cohen is this evil, like this sociopathic artistic genius, quote unquote, and the way he kind of treats art is that he treats his actors almost as they're nothing more than just props to him. So he will do whatever it takes to make them do what he wants them to do. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of House of Wax, where like when you are watching the performance and you suddenly realize that some of these performers are like people turned like people done awful like horrific things to make this art form that you're seeing come to life. It reminds me a little bit of House of Wax when the people realized like the wax figures were people and whatnot. Spoiler alert for House of Wax. Spoiling everything with this one. I'm with you. Sander Cohen was I didn't even think about it until I saw it in the book here, and I'm like, you're like, he is like, the plot twist is the most interesting story beat in BioShock to me, but like Sander Cohen in terms of like the lead up to it is a little bit more memorable than the final boss. I had another, you mentioned interviews. Did you interview people? Like, how did you interview the developers from some of these games for this book?
Yeah. So that was one of the aims of the book as well, because I didn't want it to just be a listicle book. I didn't want to just kind of run off 51 bosses and that's it. I really kind of want to get into how these bosses were made, what decisions were made for the bosses, and perhaps any scrapped ideas as well. And I kind of wanted to have like a surprise to the reader. Because I don't highlight it at all in the contents or anything like, oh, here's a boss with an interview. I want to surprise and delight the reader. So when they're reading through it from start to finish, they'll be like, oh, this one has an interview. So it did take most of the making of the book to do, but I feel like it was worth it. And especially when it comes to the first boss of D&D and BioShock and Portal 2, it really kind of shows the reader like how these bosses came to be. So yeah, it was a big effort, but I feel like it was worth it in the end.
Absolutely. One of the things I loved about this, and I cited the Golden Dragon, which is the first boss for the Golden Dragon from D&D from 1974. Like, there was so much research done into that chapter, man. Like I read the entire chapter and I was just like completely enthralled the whole time, because I love video game history, and a lot of the books I've covered, like I said, are more listicle things, which I like for just kind of like, what's, one of the things where it's like, oh, what other like movie tie-in games have I not heard of? And you get to look at this book, so it's nice for reference. This was really cool to me because it scratched my video game history nerd itch. Where like I said, the D&D chapter was just like so interesting, just learning about all the influences that the developers had going into it. And also currently I'm on a D&D kick. I haven't played in like 5 years, and I'm actually getting a campaign together with some friends, and we'll be playing rolling some new characters soon. So I'm really looking forward to diving back into that somewhat soon. And I guess, like, how many interviews did you end up doing for this book? Like, what, in terms of the research for this book? I asked before what the methodology was in choosing the bosses, but once you figured out which bosses you were covering, what was the research process like for writing about this?
I mean, like, first of all, it was, I apologize if it sounds obvious, but it was playing like the bosses. It was playing the games like from start to finish. I mean, that's like the number one research you can do when it comes to these books. I mean, a lot of people can read Wikipedias or, like watch YouTube players or speed runs, but unless you have a controller in your hand and you're playing the game start to finish without any save states or anything else, that is the best way, and that's what I did. And around this time, I had a Steam Deck as well, so I was playing a lot of games, like a lot. And like Bioshock was one of the examples on the Steam Deck, so playing that start to finish. And the thing is, like, I didn't focus the list around interviews. It was the other way around. When the list was finished, I thought, oh, it'd be great to have this boss have some insights into how this came to be. And I just asked, like, a lot of people kind of wonder, like, how these interviews come to be. And it really is like how it is in, like, back in like 30, 40 years ago. Instead of picking up the phone, I'd reach out on LinkedIn, Twitter, well, back when it was called Twitter.
I still call it Twitter. Fuck that
good,
other name. No. I refuse to call it the other name.
I'm with you. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, it was just like going from there, and just like talking about over Zoom, or just sending over like an email like full of questions, just going from there. And I was asking it from like a player's perspective, because I was thinking, like, oh, how would like this boss have been like in this certain way? But also, I'd look at the backstories. I mean, like, for example, like going back to Rogue Squadron 2, that was meant to be part of a remastered trilogy on the Wii, but it got scrapped like soon after Disney bought Lucasfilm, and apparently it's in a vault somewhere. Disney, if you're listening, please bring it out, because Rogue Squadron is incredible.
So wait, they made the whole game, and
they remastered Rogue Squadron 1, 2, and 3 as a trilogy, and Factor 5 developers, they were making it for Wii with some extra levels, and then it got scrapped.
Oh my god!
Yeah, it got scrapped. So I managed to speak to the producer of Rogue Squadron 2, and he speaks about what he was planning to do with the Battle of Endor that features in the book, of his plans for the remaster. So that's all in there. So yeah, just stuff like that. So it was things like, if you don't know about remaster, then you're going to know about it now because of the book, and the producer's going to talk about what he would have done with that level in the remaster. So yeah, it's just stuff like that, really, Josh. Like, I really kind of wanted to get into. So yeah, really fun. It took a while, but I feel like it was worth it.
Absolutely. I feel like in general, there's almost an art, I think, to like taking a lot of the specific things in like researching game history and finding a way to make it appeal to a casual audience. And I feel like the way you've kind of written it, like, let me put it this way, like the casual audience, anyone who's not a gamer, that's a little bit different. But if you're talking about like anyone has a passing interest in video game history and just the like looking back on that, like it's hard to kind of parse out like what to include and what not to include in something. So what I like about your book is that it does a good job of keeping things interesting without going into too much of the technical nitty-gritty details.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, that's kind of like what I do in my job as a freelance writer. I mean, I write at iMore, Tech Radar, Tom's Guide, like all the places. And the one thing that has been drilled into me, and I follow it into the book, is like, you're writing it for someone who may not be interested but has a passing interest in it instead. So appeal to them, like, be straightforward and guiding to them, but don't be patronizing, which is something I never want to do, never have done, never want to do. And that was the aim for the book. Like, if you just have a passing interest in gaming, and I did the same to making a Tomb Raider as well. If you have heard of Lara Croft or the making of if you've heard of the first two games, then this could interest you. And I just like the idea of like someone's grandparent perhaps like picking this up and reading it with their their grandchild and seeing how a boss came to be. I like the idea of that, and that was kind of the mission, really. So yeah, it was really kind of not to lose someone in the technicalities of a boss or history that someone may not care for. I was really trying to get into like the simplicity and the appeal of what made a game and a boss so special.
I getcha. Now, let me see. Hold on. With referencing the Tomb Raider book, when you wrote that, what lessons did you learn from writing your Tomb Raider book that you were then able to in turn use when you were writing this book?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So I think a big thing that I learned was I think it came to the interviews, really. It was like, how can I kind of introduce the reader to someone who developed the game, but how their interest came to be in their inspirations for a boss, how they took it on as a group, and then how they look back on it all these years later. And that's the same as Tomb Raider, like how they kind of like, created Lara Croft, created the levels, the T-Rex, the music, and everything else, and what they feel like looking back on it 25, 26 years later. So that was a big thing, really, how like an interview appeals to a casual reader, to make it concise, because there are different layouts as well for interviews. You go on certain sites, it could be like a question and answer layout, but I like the layout of having like a conversation, which is in the book, and I think that's a big thing, really, because it has to tell a story, which is another part really about I've learned from making a Tomb Raider. If you tell it like a story, then that's going to be more appealing to a more general reader as well, because knowing that there are story beats of how Lara Croft came to be, how the games are made, and how people look back on it is a big thing. And having that compressed, having that theory, that narrative compressed into a lot of these bosses, and not just the ones that include the interviews, because the way I went through it with the layout was how these boss came to be in a game, what they do, how to beat it, and things like that. And if there's a remake like Resident Evil 3, I mention it. So it's having a strong narrative. That's really kind of what I gained from the making a Tomb Raider. So that way it guides the reader, makes them interested, and makes them, just kind of enthralled, really, hopefully, anyway, to keep going to see what else there are in the book for bosses.
Kind of tangentially connected to this, like when writing, because I mentioned before about trying to make things approachable. In your opinion, how much of a balance do you need to, should people, I guess it depending on like what you're going for with your publication, whether it's writing an article or writing a book, but like what type of balance should be struck between like going into the nitty gritty technical details and the making it more approachable for people who may not be into those nitty gritty details? Like I've done many episodes on my Patreon about like the Nintendo's MMC chips, how they used it to, depending on which MMC chip in the NES cartridges that they had, determined like what type of capabilities the game could do. Like MMC 3 was in Mario 3, MMC 1 or 2, I think 2 was only in like 2 different games, and MMC 1 was like your Metroids and stuff. It's been over a year since I did the research on it, but like that type of thing, that's interesting to me. But like I just rattled off a whole bunch of proper nouns or acronyms that most listeners, unless they do the research, are going to be like what the fuck does that mean? Like what? Like that's all a bunch of like random letters to me. So I guess my question is, how do you find the balance between those two things? Is it trying to take complicated things and make them simplistic, or only gleaning out specific details? Like what type of balance do you look for with that, and how do you do it?
So I think first of all, it kind of goes back into like basically a previous life of mine. Before I was a writer, I was a tech support guy at a phone shop, and I would help customers with their tech queries. I'd set up iPhones, Android phones, I'd fix issues with them, but a lot of my job was to explain what was happening, as I'd go in certain stages, but explain it in a way that they understood it. So that way, once they understood it, they wouldn't come back. I'm not saying I don't want to see them again. It was just the fact that if they came across the issue again, they'd be able to know how to solve it because they understand it in a different way. So that's kind of where it came from, really. And to be honest, like I think when it comes to the balance, it's you can explain anything in a simpler term. I mean, I feel like a lot of people are hesitant to do that because when they talk about the technicalities of certain like things, it's easier for them. It's like a comfort blanket for them. But I feel like it's really important in this day and age to explain everything as clear and concise as you can. An example of this is when I talk about Star Fox on the SNES. I mentioned the Super FX chip, and I speak to Giles Goddard, who had a hand in Mario 64, but also Star Fox, and explained it, with the Super FX. And I explained like why the chip was important for that specific game. And essentially, it brought, 3D graphics to this one game because of this chip. That's all you have to say about the chip. You don't have to say more about the intricacies about it and things. That's all you have to say. Someone who is, casually playing a game, maybe a couple weeks, will understand that. And it's not patronizing. It gets to the point. And that's the important thing as well, because if you don't get to the point, the reader's going to be bored. They want that information quick, concisely, and they want to get to the point and move on. That's all they want. So, yeah, it is a balance, but I feel like it's important. and imperative. And I feel like if you don't, you're going to lose a lot of readers who you want to reach out to.
Do you feel like there's sometimes ever a loss of not, because like the books that would have that nitty gritty information, whether it's articles, books, or otherwise, is not going to get a lot of reaction to it because it, like you said, you need to appeal. Like if you want people to learn about it, you need to appeal to the
Yeah.
broadest audience possible. But like, do you feel like there's like a loss of thing? Maybe loss isn't the right term, but do you feel like we're missing something by not having more information on those nitty gritty things?
Uh, Not really, because at the end of the day, I mean, we've all started from somewhere. We haven't. If we're trying to learn something, we don't go straight into the technicalities of it. We all have a starting point. We
That's
all have a
true.
starting point, and we kind of have the building blocks and the foundation from there. And that's kind of how I approach my writing. You have to start from somewhere. Because if you just kind of like join the reader like halfway down the road, you've lost them. They're so confused and they don't know what's going on. You may as well just stop. So, I think there's room for both. You have to guide them at the start, and eventually, as long as you explain it concisely, then you're good. They will be able to kind of follow along and understand it in a way that's approachable. So, yeah, I feel like there's room for everyone there. You just have to guide them.
All right. That I think I agree with that. It's funny. I was talking to some friends of the show earlier this year and the year prior. I did an interview with two game preservationists,
Mm.
Rockman Cosmo and Naoya Shinoda, and they've been preserving Japanese feature phone games. Like the
Yeah.
flip phone games from like the early to mid aughts and everything. Um, and the first episode I did with them was in January of 2023. It was a really, I loved the interview and the conversation. I was like, it'd be cool if I caught up with them a year later and see what the status of
Mm.
preservation is in there. And it was not their fault. I handled it completely incorrectly because you really needed to listen to that first episode to make any sense out of
Mm.
this new one. And so because of that, I actually had some people reach out to be like, this is a fun episode. I don't know what anyone's talking about. And I went, okay, all right,
Mm.
good to know. So it's a bummer because I loved the idea and I did not execute that correctly. I should have, done a little primer at the beginning of the episode or something like that, just to give every listener a freaking, I can't speak, sorry, just to give every listener the same ground level like bit of education on like what feature
Mm.
phone games are and what they've done to preserve them and
Mm.
all that other stuff. So I very much can understand and relate to that actually a decent amount. Uh, Now, back to some of your personal opinions and
Mm.
on boss fights specifically. Do you have a favorite boss or a least favorite boss? Like, what would be your least? Maybe not the one that like, because I know if I ask someone what their favorite boss is or favorite of whatever insert thing here, then it's, oh my gosh, too many to choose from. But like off the top of your head, like first thing that jumps into your mind doesn't mean it's necessarily your
Mm.
favorite or least favorite, but like what's one of the best bosses you've played and what's one of the worst bosses you've ever played or experienced?
So, the first one that jumps out is the very last boss of Metal Gear Solid 4, and it's in the book, and it's Snake versus Ocelot on top of Arsenal Gear. Have you played that, Josh?
I have not. I've only actually played Metal Gear Solid 1 and about a third of Metal Gear
Right.
Solid 2. I've been meaning to actually go. I think I played in Metal Gear Solid 2, got up to the big dude on roller skates. And I'm like, well, this is interesting. And then just didn't get around to finishing it. But yeah, so I've been meaning to get back to it at some point, but you know how life is. So no, I have not played Metal Gear
Right,
Solid
okay.
4 at
So
all.
I'm anxious that I'm going to be spoiling this for you, Josh, so I apologize.
Don't worry about
So
it.
this has a lot of weight behind it because when you are facing Ocelots, it does an amazing because I'm actually replaying like Metal Gear Solid 4 now, and a lot of it is nostalgia. And as you play the game,
Hmm.
you're given like a prompt to press the cross button, and when you do, scenes kind of appear from previous games, and this sense of nostalgia is just all around the game. But it's only when you get to fighting Ocelot onto Arsenal Gear. So as soon as you start the first bit of the boss fight, it has the music from Metal Gear Solid 1. like the encounter music, and the
Okay.
life bar is
Yeah.
exactly the same from Metal Gear Solid One. So yeah, so it's
Oh.
like you're almost facing Liquid again on top of Metal Gear to kind of wrap it back to the first game, and which is amazing. But also, which I mentioned in the book, the first boss you ever face in the Metal Gear Solid series, and I mean that, Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3, and 4, is Ocelot. And now you're facing Ocelot as the final boss in Metal Gear Solid 4. So a lot
Yeah.
rhymes to that. And as you get along, I mean, you're seeing these nostalgic moments, you're fighting, and then as the boss fight progresses, then you have music from Metal Gear Solid 2, and the life bar changes to some from Metal Gear Solid 2, and it changes like that to Metal Gear Solid 3, and it just keeps going and going. And as you're kind of fighting, like you're almost kind of brought back to kind of all the times when you played the previous games. It could be Metal Gear Solid 3, like fighting the End or the Fury. It could be Metal Gear Solid 2 as you're fighting like multiple Metal Gear Rays and things. And it's just a culmination. And you're brought back to kind of like when you first played these games. And it's such like a heavy thing that you're just brought with this massive sense of nostalgia. And there's something else that happens in 4, which I'm definitely not going to spoil, but it's monumental. And that also kind of pops into your head as well. And eventually at the end, when Ocelot does die, you are just feeling like, God, this is the end. Like it's been a massive sprint and you're there. And you're almost overwhelmed. And I felt that when I first played the game in 2008. It was just something else. So I'll stop there, Josh. But yeah, that is like a memorable thing. For me, for my Gear Solid
Mm.
4. Now it's the worst boss, isn't it?
Yeah. What or whichever one you enjoyed the least that you can think of.
Okay. Yeah. So actually, I was thinking about this earlier, because I was trying to find a way to play it on my Mac. So Resident Evil 3 remake and Nemesis.
Mm-hmm.
I was so disappointed with this game because they changed the narrative in a way that Nemesis was no longer like following you almost across almost the entire game. It was such a shame. He was kind of left to kind of like cutscenes or scripted moments
Okay.
compared to the game where compared to the original game where you had a choice to face him or not, or he would just randomly appear, and the remake didn't have it. And there were certain points in the remake where it would just be an arena where you would face him. And there was one which I really do not like, where he's running across like a almost like a huge rat, like for some reason, and you have to hit these certain canisters, and then you have to be. It was a very like average boss fight, which never happened in the original game. And when it got to the end, it just didn't feel. It didn't feel like a crescendo like the original game did, and it was just terrible. And yeah, it was just a massive shame, to be honest. And it wasn't great, and just disappointed, to be honest. It was, yeah,
Mm.
it fit more like DLC to Resident Evil 2, to be honest. It should have been a full game in my opinion. But yeah, that was the worst boss fight for me, both in a narrative sense, the gameplay sense, and how much I feel like Capcom just messed up, especially with how good they did with Resident Evil 2 with Mr. X. So yeah, that's my two choices.
Now it sounds like you're a pretty big Resident Evil fan then.
A little bit.
Okay.
A little bit.
The only reason I've never played a Resident Evil game, so I'm like, I think I tried playing the remake of Resident Evil 2 at a friend's house, and it scared the shit out of me so bad. And I'm like, nope, nope, hard pass, no thank you. Jesus, take the wheel. I'm
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, definitely. I can
So
relate.
I was going to ask, like, if you had like a recommendation to start, maybe I guess maybe just the first one then, like the original PS1 one. I'm like, I understand it's tank controls and the cameras are wonky and stuff like that, but I'm kind of curious what it's like all these years later.
Yeah, honestly, like I would just. I mean, I know they are re-releasing the original games on GOG, the DRM3 site. So they've already released Resident Evil 1 and 2, and you can play it on your modern PC now. So I would recommend just going through them, really. So going through 1, going through 2. I believe the third one is out any moment. So yeah, just go through them, and then I'd recommend going through the remakes as soon as you finish the third game,
Yeah.
and just seeing how that compares. Um, because, like I say, the second one is fantastic in how it's been remade and everything else. And the first game, again, that was remade in 2002 for the GameCube. But to me, even now, it feels like it was made like last year. Like it's so good in its gameplay, its graphics, everything, and it fits that tank control for the remake of Resident Evil One fits the location of the mansion, so it's really great. So yeah, I just recommend that. Really, start from Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 original ones, then do the remakes, and then let me know what you think about Nemesis.
It might be a little bit so I can get around to it, but I will definitely let you know if I ever do. It's just
Great.
a matter of figuring out the time. Now I have a couple wrap up questions for you. We are getting close to our hour long time limit here, so I want to wrap up with a few questions here. One, well, I guess I wrap up with two questions. One is from the first is from a podcast I like called Clear and Vivid from Alan Alda. I love that podcast, though I don't get to listen to it as much as I used to. And he always wraps up his episodes by asking his guest 7 quick questions and invite 7 quick answers. I'm not going to ask all 7 questions. A lot of them are his show's all about communication. So like one of the questions is like, how do you tell someone they got their facts wrong? Which I think is a really interesting question. Not really applicable to this though, but I'll let my audience and you mull that over for if you want to think about that off mic or something like that. But I like that question a lot. So I actually interviewed someone last week's episode was an interview as well, so I'm not going to use the same question as that one. So the question that I'm going to ask you based off one of those questions from Alan Alda is, which book changed your life?
Oh, that's an easy one. That is The Writer's Tale by Russell T Davies.
Okay.
Yeah, in 2010, I believe. That was one of the books that made me consider writing as a career.
Oh, it's a Doctor Who book.
Yeah. So
I thought the name sounded familiar.
Yeah, it was a big inspiration when writing and making a Tomb Raider, first of all, because I've always been a fan of Russell T Davies, like even before Doctor Who. It was like his shows like Queer as Folk and the name eludes me, the show. But yeah, anyway, it was just amazing. I've always respected him. And this book, almost like, it's almost like a documentary into him writing the Series 4 with Catherine Tate and the specials where David Tennant leaves as the 10th Doctor. And it shows him with Benjamin Cook, who was then the editor of Doctor Who magazine, to and froing into how to make these episodes and thinking what to do and thinking on his feet and brainstorming these ideas. And it was so great because the thing is, it wasn't just showing like what he thought about the episodes and things. It also kind of showcased how he approached the episodes and how he wrote and everything there. And it was so good. And I read it every couple of years because it just shows like just how good a writer he is in his thinking, and also how he kind of misses his deadlines as well, which I can relate to now and again. But it was like so inspiring, and honestly, if you haven't read it, I really kind of encourage it because it really kind of changed like kind of what I wanted to do as a career, and yeah, definitely a big inspiration for these books.
Okay, that is the first someone has referenced Doctor Who, surprisingly, as that's genuinely surprising. Doctor Who's crazy popular. I watched a little bit of the revival back from 2005. I stopped with David Tennant, not for any particular reason, just I ran out of there. I had binged Doctor Who for like a month and a half of just nonstop watching. I'm like, I need a break, and then I haven't gone back yet. I've been meaning to for quite some time, but all right. My last question for you before we go into plugs and shout outs and all that good stuff is questions from Courtney. Questions from Courtney. Courtney is my wife, and as people heard in the last episode and now this one, famously, she is not into any of the stuff I am into. Not into video games, not into anime or geek culture and all that good stuff. But she's a very supportive partner, and so I always ask her like, hey, what question should I ask my guest for the episode? Like, and it's usually something that has nothing to do with what they do. And it's actually kind of funny. I didn't actually intend for it to sync up with this, but her question is also book related. If you could live in a book universe, which one would you want to live in?
Oh man. oh, Courtney with a hard question. Right. Let's think. Oh, that's interesting.
You can take your time too. I can edit out the silence, so don't worry.
Yeah, they're good. Yeah, I need like a minute.
Take your time, man.
Does like a manga book work?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I read like a lot of like Dragon Ball manga.
Yeah.
I just love like everything there, and I read it on my iPad, and and the only reason I'd love to live in that world is because there is a room called the hyperbolic time chamber.
Yep.
Where you can go in and you can spend an entire year in this room, but to the outside world, a day passes. And I would love to be in that room just so I could get like a lot of work done and the future book that I'm working on. So that way I can have it all done in 1 year, whereas I can just step out of the hyperbolic time chamber and it's done in a day, and that's it. So that's the only reason why.
Honestly, I'm kind of. I mean, yeah, the world might get destroyed a bunch of times. We're gonna have to deal with Frieza every now and then, and freaking, Majin Buu will show up later on, and just kind of. Just as long as we don't live near a major metropolitan area, we should be good.
Yeah, that's the main thing. As long as I get my books finished.
Well, and actually, it depends on where it takes place. Like, does it take place in Japan? Then we're probably fine, right? Right. Well, actually, no, because they always take the villains away from the city to not hurt civilians. So where is this fight going to happen?
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. Yeah, I think as long as like they can somehow bring the room, like maybe to my apartment, that's the main thing. Just extend the apartment and have it in there, and let Goku and everyone like worry about Frieza and everyone else. I'll just do my books in the room. It's fine.
I like it. But all right. Well, we can wrap up this episode. Daryl, thank you so much for joining me, man. This was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you for spending some time with me here. And before we go, where can the good people find you online? And of course, what would you like to promote?
Sure. So you can find me, like, first of all, my site, darylbaxter.com. I have a newsletter called Springboard, so it goes into kind of like the making of like some of the books, and also just some thoughts about like gaming, lifestyle, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
You can find me in all around the places like iMore, Tech Radar, Cool Magazines. I've also got my podcast, Power Keys. I have interviews with guests about memorable games, boss stage and everything else, and yes, of course, the books. So Making a Tomb Raider and 50 Years of Boss Fights, that's available on Amazon. Pen and Sword, who are the publisher, White Owl, and yeah, to be honest, you could just Google 50 Years of Boss Fights and it'll be there. So yeah, it's all good. And like I say, I've got a third book in the works, which I believe should be announced by the end of the year, and hopefully should be out by the end of next year.
All right. Well, listeners can definitely be on the lookout for all of that. And like I said before, I love this book you wrote on 50 Years of Boss Fights. I really hope my listeners will check it out. Love the concept. Love how it was written. It definitely worth a read. For myself, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Twitch, at Still Loading Pod in all those locations, at Still Loading Podcast on YouTube. You can support the show in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on Apple Podcasts or whichever podcasting app you use. Not only is that free for all of you, but it helps me out and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I like feeling warm and fuzzy. It also helps please the algorithm gods and hopefully maybe pushes the show into different people's recommended feeds. I don't know. But that's completely free for y'all, and you can do that at your leisure. That would help me out a lot, and I'd really appreciate it. I also have a Patreon, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For as little as $1 a month, you get all the episodes a little bit earlier with better audio quality, along with patron voting rights, which help guide the direction of the show. I do quarterly polls where patrons can vote and help me pick future episode topics. At the time this episode comes out, the next episode that will be coming out for it is on Gunbolt, I want to say, Warhammer 40K Gunbolt. That was the next one. That game actually has already been beaten and the episode is recorded. So there'll be another poll going up very soon. So be on the lookout for that. But that's all at just $1 a month. For $3 a month, you get everything I mentioned prior, along with patron shoutouts, which you heard at the beginning of this episode. For $4 a month, you get everything I mentioned prior, plus 2 mini bonus episodes, which covers a variety of topics. Like I mentioned before, the Nintendo MMC chips. I go into some nerdy, nitty-gritty detail on that. But then I also do weird stuff, like I got the Gamer 5 portable system from my arcade, which is definitely not filled with 200 bootleg games. And of varying quality, like Curly Frog or whatever I don't even remember the name anymore. There was a game called Curly Frog and Curly Frog 2 or something, or Curly Monkey. That's what it was. Curly Monkey and Curly Monkey 2. Which apparently the first one deserved a sequel. Who knew? But so once a month I've been reviewing 8 games at a time on that thing. So there is a lot over there. I think actually we're coming up to like over 60 mini episodes. So lots of content over at the $4 level. And finally, this is probably my longest Patreon plug for quite some time. So I apologize for the length, listeners. The last plug is the $5 level, which you get everything prior, the bonus episodes, early access, voting rights, and patron shoutouts. And you also get my monthly movie podcast, which right now I guess this is September that this is coming out. So there is one last episode of Still Bonding, which was my monthly James Bond podcast where me and a bunch of friends bonded over 007. No Time to Die. Actually, today is the day that No Time to Die just came out. And there's one more episode coming, which it'll be a little surprise for y'all if you listen to that. And then after that, it's Still Family, my monthly Fast and Furious podcast, where all my guests who join me aren't just friends, they're family. So you can check all that out at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. But that's it. That's all the time I got for you. Once again, apologize for the long plugs at the end for myself, but that's all I have. Thank you all so much for listening. Daryl, thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.